We've got this really interesting report here from the Congressional Research Service all about the Section 321 de minimis exemption. We figured we'd take a deep dive into it with you and see how this little rule doesn't seem so little when you actually read about it, how it shapes what we can all buy and how much we pay for stuff.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, especially when you consider how much it's changed since it first started way back in 1938.
Oh, yeah, I know, right? It's crazy. This thing was made to save the government a little bit of paperwork on just a few dollars worth of imports back then. And now it's like this major global trade thing. The de minimis exemption basically means you can bring goods into the U.S. without having to pay any taxes on them as long as they're under a certain value.
Yeah, and that certain value is actually a really key part of the story. Actually has this great anecdote from a congressional hearing in 1938 about a guy bringing $4.75 worth of china across the border from Canada.
Seriously, can you imagine customs even bothering with that today?
It seems funny now, but back then they were really worried about wasting time and resources on these tiny little amounts of taxes. So that's how Section 321 came about. It basically gave customs officers the power to decide what was worth their time to deal with.
So it really was all about the government being efficient and not so much about helping out shoppers or importers.
But here's where things get interesting. Starting in the 1990s, the purpose of this exemption shifted. It became less about saving the government a few pennies and more about pushing for free trade.
So how'd that happen?
Congress started raising the amount of that de minimis threshold. And not just because of inflation either. They were doing it on purpose to make it easier for more stuff to get into the U.S. without any taxes.
And this was all happening when globalization was really taking off too, right?
For sure. Countries all over were looking for ways to reduce barriers to trade. And the de minimis exemption became a tool for that. It was like the U.S. decided to lead the way toward freer trade using this little exemption. Like they were trying to nudge everyone in that direction.
And that kind of leads us up to the big change that happened in 2015, right?
Yeah, the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, or TFTE as people call it, that raised the de minimis threshold all the way up to $800. That was a huge deal.
So it went from being about saving the government some time to basically saying, we want to boost the economy and bring in more imports.
And it wasn't just for the U.S. either. Even the World Customs Organization and the World Trade Organization started encouraging other countries to do something similar.
So that $800 threshold wasn't just like an American thing. It was sending a message to the whole world about how serious the U.S. was about opening up trade. Did other countries actually follow suit?
A lot of them did, but their thresholds are usually lower than ours. Still, it shows how this little exemption has really changed how global trade works.
It really is amazing how something that started so small could have such a big impact.
It really goes to show how connected everything is in global trade these days.
But even with all this talk about free trade and helping the economy, also brings up some worries, right?
It does. And that's where things get really interesting.
What are some of the maybe not so good things about this exemption?
One big concern is that illegal stuff could slip through the cracks more easily. Things like opioids and products made with forced labor coming into the country without being checked because of the exemption. There are just so many packages coming in, it's hard to catch everything.
Yeah, that's definitely a scary thought. Is there any way to stop that from happening without just getting rid of the exemption completely?
That's the tough part about how Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, is trying to deal with this problem. They've got these pilot programs going on, like the Entry Type 86 test and the Section 321 data pilot.
So instead of checking every single package, they're using data to try to find the ones that seem risky, especially with all the online shopping happening now, right?
Oh, yeah, that's a big factor. The effect of the de minimis exemption on American businesses.
So you mean it might be good for shoppers because prices are lower, but it could be hurting companies here in the U.S.?
Uses the textile and apparel industry as a good example. Companies like Shein and Temu have gotten super popular. They can ship tons of cheap clothes straight to customers without having to pay those extra taxes.
I bet that makes it tough for American companies to compete with those prices.
Makes you wonder if those low prices are coming at the expense of workers being treated fairly and the environment being protected.
You want the good things that come with free trade, but you also have to protect American businesses and workers. Can you give everyone listening a quick explanation of how those duties work with the de minimis exemption?
Sure. Lays it all out pretty clearly in Table 7. Basically, if goods have certain duties on them that are meant to protect U.S. industries from unfair trade practices like anti-dumping and countervailing duties, then the de minimis exemption doesn't apply.
So those duties are there to make sure everyone is playing by the rules, and the exemption doesn't interfere with that.
But for duties that have to do with things like national security or trade disputes, the exemption does apply, unless there's also an import quota in place.
So it's not a simple rule that's the same for everything. It all depends on what kind of duty is involved.
That's just one of the many things that make this exemption more complicated than it seems at first glance.
One thing is that inflation actually changes how much that $800 is really worth over time. So what you're saying is that $800 today doesn't buy as much as it did back in 2015 when they set the threshold.
And that creates a problem. If we just keep the amount at $800, the exemption becomes less and less effective at doing what it was supposed to do, which was reducing the number of small imports that Customs and Border Protection has to deal with.
Because as prices go up, more and more stuff will be under that $800 limit. So CBP actually ends up with more work, not less.
But on the other hand, if you try to adjust the threshold to keep up with inflation, it could mean way more goods coming into the U.S. without any duties. And that might speed up trade liberalization even more than anyone intended.
So it's like trying to balance keeping things efficient for the government with controlling how much this affects trade.
Actually mentions that Congress hasn't always been consistent with how they've handled this. Historically, they raised the de minimis threshold even faster than inflation has gone up, especially back in 1993 and 2015.
So it seems like they've been purposely making the exemption have a bigger impact on trade, even if it means maybe going against that original idea of saving administrative costs.
Even suggests that Congress could think about setting up automatic adjustments for inflation, like they do for other economic things.
That would be a pretty big change. It would mean Congress wouldn't be making the decision anymore. The threshold would just keep going up on its own.
It would. But it would also make things more predictable for businesses and for the government, which could be good for companies trying to figure out all the complicated stuff about global trade.
Yeah, I can see both sides of that argument. This exemption affects prices here in the U.S., which is something that impacts everyone, not just businesses.
It does, and it's a tricky issue. Economists generally agree that tariffs make imported goods more expensive. But whether those higher prices actually get passed on to consumers depends on a lot of things.
Things like how much competition there is in the market and whether the companies importing the goods are willing to take a hit on their profits to keep prices down.
A study from 2024 that looked at what might happen if the de minimis exemption was completely eliminated.
What did they find?
Getting rid of the exemption would probably lead to higher prices for consumers, especially for things that are often imported using the exemption, like clothes and electronics.
So all those deals on imported clothes might go away.
Maybe. Also said that there will be some good things that come out of it too, like people might buy more American-made products, and workers in the U.S. might get paid more.
So it's not as simple as saying one side wins and the other side loses.
The point is that the de minimis exemption does affect prices, and that's something that policymakers need to really think about.
Along with all the other stuff we've been talking about, like making sure it's being enforced properly and stopping illegal imports.
And speaking of enforcement, let's talk about how all these de minimis entries are putting a strain on the system.
Customs and Border Protection is basically dealing with a flood of small packages coming into the country.
Yeah, it's a logistical nightmare. Number of de minimis entries has just exploded in recent years. It went from 153 million in 2015 to over a billion in 2023, especially because this huge increase in imports is happening at the same time that CBP is being asked to do more to stop illegal goods from coming in.
You mean things like counterfeit products, drugs, and stuff made with forced labor?
It's like they're being pulled in two different directions.
Yeah.
They have to make trade easier, but also check imports more carefully.
I bet that creates a lot of tension within CBP.
It does. They just don't have enough people or resources to inspect every single package that comes in under the de minimis exemption.
So how are they handling this huge influx of imports without letting dangerous stuff slip through?
They've had to get creative about how they started using different pilot programs, like the Entry Type 86 test and the Section 321 data pilot, to try to gather more information about the shipments and figure out which ones are high risk.
So instead of trying to check everything, they're being more strategic about which packages they focus on.
But even with all that, it's pretty clear that the current system is being pushed to its limits. Suggests that Congress might need to think about some other ways to decide which imports are exempt, instead of just using the value of the goods.
So what are some of the alternatives? How could they move away from that $800 threshold?
One idea is to look at how risky the import is, instead of just how much it's worth. So instead of automatically exempting everything under $800, they could come up with a system to figure out how likely it is that a shipment has something prohibited in it.
So they could use things like the importer's track record, where the goods are coming from, and what kind of stuff is being shipped to decide how much scrutiny is needed.
Another option is to encourage importers to voluntarily join programs that help CBP enforce the rules.
Like a trusted trader program where importers who have a good history get faster processing.
The goal is to give importers a reason to cooperate with CBP and give them more information up front, which would make it easier to catch potential problems.
It seems like finding ways to do more with less is really important here.
The current system, while it has good intentions, might not be the best way to achieve that in the long run, especially with all the changes in e-commerce and global trade.
And speaking of global trade, the U.S. has been encouraging other countries to adopt de minimis exemptions too.
That's right. They want to make it easier for American businesses to export their goods to those countries.
The U.S. wants other countries to make importing easier, just like we've done here.
This is where things get a little complicated. Congress has the power to regulate commerce, which includes setting tariffs and trade policies.
That's in the Constitution, right?
Yep. But presidents also have the power to negotiate treaties and agreements with other countries.
And those agreements can sometimes be about trade, which could end up clashing with what Congress wants to do.
Exactly. The United States-Taiwan Initiative on 21st Century Trade, which is a trade agreement that the Biden administration negotiated.
Okay, so what's so interesting about that agreement when it comes to the de minimis exemption?
It has this part that says both the U.S. and Taiwan have to keep streamlined procedures for express shipments that are worth less than $2,500.
So even though that's way less than our $800 de minimis threshold, this agreement locks the U.S. into a certain level of streamlined processing for those shipments from Taiwan.
And that raises some questions about whether the president can basically go around Congress and set trade policy through these agreements.
So it's like a loophole that could weaken Congress's control over trade.
You could say that. And the report says that Congress is starting to notice this trend, and they're not too happy about it.
So how are they responding to this potential challenge to their power?
Some members of Congress are worried about this, and they're pushing for more oversight of these trade agreements. They want to make sure that Congress still has the final say on trade policy, and that the president isn't taking over that role.
It sounds like the de minimis exemption is tied into a much bigger debate about who really has the power in government and what's going to happen with U.S. trade policy.
It really is. This little provision has turned into something that has a huge impact on how we handle the complex world of global trade.
We've definitely covered a lot in this deep dive. We've talked about the history and the purpose of the de minimis exemption and all the challenges and controversies that come with it, plus some ideas for how to change it.
Yeah, we've barely scratched the surface, but it's been a good start.
And hopefully we've given you, our listener, a better understanding of this trade rule and how it affects you, from the prices you pay for things to the security of our borders.
It's definitely something that doesn't get a lot of attention, but as we've seen, it has a big impact.
And it's only going to become more important as global trade keeps changing.
Absolutely.
So if you want to learn even more about this, we highly recommend reading the full Congressional Research Service report, from a little time saver to this global trade game changer, even sparking debates about what the president can actually do.
It really is amazing how much one little rule can affect so much. So now that we're in this last part, the big question is, what happens next?
We've talked about all the problems in the debates and even some ideas for how things could be different. What should people be focusing on if they want to change how the system works?
One of the biggest and probably hardest things is figuring out how to balance everyone's interests.
And we can't forget about making sure those customs laws are being followed and stopping illegal stuff from coming in. It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. And then there's how much money the government actually gets from duties. Every time something comes into the U.S. without any taxes because of this exemption, the government loses out on some money.
And as more and more stuff gets shipped in under this rule, that adds up to a lot of lost money.
Yeah. So policymakers have to decide, are the benefits of this exemption worth the cost to the Treasury? We need more data.
Like we were saying, we don't really know exactly how the exemption is being used or what its full impact is.
Yeah. If we had better data, policymakers could make smarter decisions about whether to change things and how to do it.
And it would help Customs and Border Protection focus their efforts on the riskiest shipments, which could make things safer.
Plus, researchers could really dig into how the exemption affects the economy.
So it sounds like getting more data is the first thing we need to do, no matter what other changes might happen.
I think so. Without really understanding how things are working now, it's hard to even talk about what to do next.
I think we've made a good start today. We've explored the history and the purpose of the de minimis exemption, all the problems and the debates, and even some ideas for reform.
We definitely covered a lot.
And hopefully we've helped you, our listener, understand this trade rule a little better and how it affects you, from the prices to the security of our country.
It's something most people don't really think about, but it's a big deal.
And it's probably going to get even bigger as global trade keeps changing.